You were relatively new to the performance side of the business. You got involved in 82. You guys go to Mid-South at the end of 83. Dennis had been a veteran. He'd been around for years all over the South. Really every promotion in the South Dennis had worked for. Bobby, similar thing. I can't think of where either guy would have worked, and you'll correct me where I'm wrong, where they had killer road trips. What was the adjustment to Mid-South like for the three of you?
Well, first of all, Dennis had not worked all over the South. Think about this. And this is another reason why, and it's a shame that Dennis is so underappreciated today. And also he left right before the pay-per-view era where those big main event matches and quality video would be replayed over and over. Dennis was another guy. He was a different case than Bobby in that he was so good. He was fixed in the Tennessee territories. And he had worked Georgia, but he didn't get a spot to go to Florida. He didn't get a spot to go to the Carolinas. Actually, I've told a story. Joe Turner was his brother-in-law, and he'd really broken in the Carolinas as a referee just for a bit, but he never got to. Dennis Condrey always wanted to work the Carolinas because he had seen the territory and how big and profitable it was and everything. But when Dennis had gotten a spot later on in 75 as partners with Phil Hickerson for Nick, then he really spent most of the rest of the next 3 years. He and Phil would go to work for Ron Fuller in Knoxville, and Ron Wright would manage them. And then they'd come back to work for Nick. And then when Jarrett split off, they'd come to work for Jarrett. And one time, Rock Hunter was their manager for very briefly. Did not work out. But they could both talk on their own. And they bounced around the three Tennessee territories until Phil got hurt, had to quit the business for a while. And then Dennis that's when he got with Randy Rose and Norvell Austin in 81 and 82, and they did the Midnight Express only in Continental and in Memphis. And that's, Dennis had never been a top spot in a money-drawing territory, except, Memphis did good, but they were never figured in, really, he and Phil, as far as major payoffs. So he had all the experience in the world. And what an impeccable worker. And I'll tell you, I've gone back and looked some stuff in the past couple of days in both of them. But they just hadn't had the exposure in a major territory. It said, I'm going to put you guys I'm going to use you guys as main event attractions, and I'm going to give you a push. And until we all went to work for Watts. And so the question you asked, what kind of transition was it? The trips were the trips were a big deal, but the trips were the least of it. But what I did, honestly, I got the news overnight, Wednesday night, and Thursday, besides being on the phone with Dennis Condrey and Stan Lane and Bobby's friend Brian Thompson and Matt Sigmund, who of the Heat Seekers, who organized the Don't Tell Bobby show that we did about a year and a half ago in Knoxville, where we kayfabed him and just advertised it on the internet because he wouldn't see it there. I talked to those guys, and by the way, and Matt Sigmund was behind there was a GoFundMe that was put up for about, I don't even know if it was up for 24 hours, and that was by Matt Sigmund, and it's for Bobby's funeral expenses and any medical and rest of the money would be going to the kids, whatever. But they took it down after only a day because I think they were wanting 10 grand and they got over 20 that quick. And they took it down because at first the kids had not wanted any, type of fundraiser or thing or whatever. And Dundee's going to be pitching in. But then when Matt said, no, we want to do it, and everybody wants to do it. But then they took it down, point being, after they'd raised over twice as much as they were looking for, because they didn't want it to look like they were just trying to raise money. And, and honestly, I bet they would have got $100,000. And it's not like it was a shady deal, so I wish they'd have left it up. But that just goes to show you they didn't they didn't want anybody to have a ill memory of anything Bobby was associated with. Anyway, where was I going with all of this? What was I saying? Oh, so we went to Louisiana. And that was the thing. After I talked to those people the other day, a fan here several years ago had gotten me a 30-something disc Midnight Express compilation. And it's in fairly chronological order, start to finish. And I mentioned on the drive-thru that we did this earlier this week, Stacy's in California because her mother's had heart surgery and she's doing better and fine and appreciates everybody talking about that. And then I hurt my back, although on further reflection, it is my hip that I've had issues with before in a major way. And so since it was a struggle to walk from room to room and I couldn't get in any position besides flat that wasn't painful, I said, I'm going to watch these DVDs and curl up on the bed with Harley Quinn. And that's where I realized, because when you look at something, even that, I was there, I was in the middle of it, but it's 38 years later, 7 years later, whatever. And you look at things with fresh eyes and you understand things better. And I realize now that, for one thing, I sucked when I got to Mid-South, for me. And I don't mean this to sound egotistical, but yes, everybody's like, oh, that kid, he can talk his ass off. No, it wasn't. I am shooting holes in a lot of my promos in Mid-South. But if I could have gone to Mid-South like I was when I went to Dallas a year later after having that course in wrestling from Bobby and Dennis and Bill Watts and Bill Dundee, I believe they probably would have killed me, because I started kind of figuring out how to fucking actually do this right for me. But anyway, all of us, and Bobby in particular, realized that this was a big opportunity because I've only been to business 16 months. So I'm like, if somebody else besides who I was just working for wants me, that's a big opportunity. But Dennis knew, especially, that he'd been around that long and no promoter of that level had ever come and said, I'm going to build around you. We're going to give you a push. You are going to be a main event fucking talent. We're going to protect you. So, as I said, Dennis's work was always impeccable. It was never flashy, and it wasn't big things. It was always being in the right place, never being lost, never making a mistake, the timing, etc., and the psychology. And he was the one that was telling both of us how to think. But going back and watching Bobby, it was incredible because I'd seen him have all these matches in Memphis, and I knew what he could do, but I'd never seen him do all of it that much, that well, in front of that many people. He was just on every night. And watching the crowd react to, or the crowds on these videos, like one of our first matches, and probably the first time he dropped a knee off the top rope in Houston at Sam Houston Coliseum, was against Magnum TA and Wrestling 2 in that program. And the people are already, hot into it, and they're reacting, and it's Houston. It's a hot crowd anyway. But Brian, the pop that they get now these days when you show a video where somebody fucks up and misses a dive or fall, it's that person is obviously fucked up. That sound, not a boo or a yay or a wow, but a oh, like, oh shit. You know what I'm talking about.
Of course.
That was the kind of reaction that Bobby was getting. And this is in Houston, Texas. They've seen all the best talent. They've had weekly or bi-weekly matches for 50 years at that point in the Sam Houston Coliseum. Bobby's knee drop off the top rope or some of the other shit, the bumps that he would take, were getting on purpose and done correctly. We're getting the pop like, oh, he just fucked that guy up. Those people had still never seen anything like that. And with wrestling too, it was like Bobby and Dennis were both in until we got with the rock and roll. We're both in with guys that they had either never worked with or barely ever worked with before, right? Dennis had passing, contact with wrestling too in Georgia or whatever, but the Midnight were having their matches, and they were calling the matches because it was the Midnight's job to get over, but at the same time, they were going in with guys like Magnum, who was so green. I'm watching now, and some of the things I haven't seen for 30 years, I'm seeing Magnum being totally lost and just actually turn around at one point out of frustration. You just walk out of the ring and get back on the apron. He got everybody else is where they're supposed to be, and he just got lost. Oh, fuck it. I'm just leaving. But he'd only been in business a year and a half, right? He's in the main events. People loved him, but he's green. But they're calling these matches for these guys they've never worked with and never been with, to do all of those guys' stuff to them and taking bumps for it and getting those guys over. And in the process, Dennis explained it, we get over by getting the match over. And then, good Lord, there's a goddamn giant motorcycle rally with police escorts going down the street outside the castle here. Dennis's philosophy was, we go out and we get over by getting the match over and then getting the heat at the end, whether it's because we fucked them on the finish, or if we put them over, we get heat after, or obviously I go out on TV and get the heat back verbally. And another thing, well, we can do the fucking happy horse shit where the baby faces are kicking the shit out of us at the start and everybody's happy because we make them laugh, and then we make them mad because we made them quit laughing when we take over and we're kicking the shit out of their fucking guys. So Bobby's in there with two, and two's in his early 50s. So it's not like he's going to keep up a running race with fucking Bobby Eaton. But Bobby wants to get he wants to get over, and he knows that two's knee lift is over. So this was great. And Bobby was like a greyhound running the ropes, and he would just call a simple spot with two where two could just stay in the middle of the ring and Bobby'd do all the fucking work. And two was a pro. He'd been a veteran for 30 years, Johnny Walker. He knew how to give you a hip toss. He knew how to give you an arm drag. He knew how to fucking give you a knee lift. He knew how to, you call a spot to him, he can remember it. So in one of these Houston matches, they lock up and two gets the fucking head, or Bobby gets the headlock. And two shoots him off, and it's one tackle, drop down, arm drag, hip toss, knee lift. Just that simple, where two can just stay in the middle of the ring, and Bobby's the one crossing the fucking ring and doing all the work. But it's at 100 miles an hour. It's flawless. And then not only does, when two gives him the knee lift, Bobby has taken the arm drag, hip toss. He's come up, bent over, selling his face and his back, where he's been tossed around in perfect position. As two hits him with the knee lift, he turns and flies over the fucking top rope, barely touching anything. It lands on the goddamn floor outside, and the place blows because he would figure out a way to take a bump and land in a place that you would never expect. So it surprised people as well as popping them at the same time. So he could have taken a bump from the fucking knee lift and the place would have popped, but he takes a bump and flies over the top rope when it doesn't look humanly possible that somebody could have done that from that direction. And the place goes batshit. And you ought to say, I think Alice Marie Nelson was the photographer in Houston. I'm watching these matches and I'm thinking, we've talked about Mid-South had been down because the guys were a little bigger and a little slower, right? And they weren't having matches like this, and they weren't doing these Tennessee spots. And the photographers and the ring seconds, they're all running because they can't figure out which direction one member of the Midnight Express is going to take a bump on top of them next. Because it's completely different style of spots and style of tag team matches than they'd been seeing, and everybody was, flipped out by it. But anyway, that's where, you go back and look at, and some of this stuff's on YouTube for folks, and I don't know what's on the network or the Peacock or whatever, but watch Bobby Eaton in 1984 Mid-South, and watch Dennis Condrey too while you're at it. There's nobody doing anything like either one of them today, and that's not knocking the modern wrestling. When you watch this with a critical eye, you can see nobody takes bumps this, and they're calling it all in the ring. There's nothing pre-planned except the finish, and that's probably been handed to us verbally by a referee or a go-between. So you can tell when things don't quite work out because the guy that they're doing it with has heard it just now for the first time, but they cover it. You can't tell. They were just so smooth, and that's I was talking to Dennis Condrey, obviously, Thursday morning. And, he was, this is something funny. He said, Corny, I've gone from a semi-badass to an old maid because we were both crying ridiculously to the point where we had to hang up at one point because we were embarrassed for each other. But I've seen Dennis of the recent years, the kinder, gentler Dennis Condrey, tear up a little bit at a banquet speech or whatever, or something, but I've never heard Dennis or seen Dennis cry actually out loud before. But I've only known him 45 years, so there's a first time for everything. But we were all thanking each other for what we'd done for each other, etc. But I told him, I said, that was the thing. When we all got there, Bobby and to our first break, Bobby and Dennis had the talent and the experience. And Dennis could cut a promo, and I always was entertained by his promos, even more so in person. But the only thing they couldn't do was talk. And the only thing that I could do was talk. Because we mentioned, I've never had the first time I ever took any bump in a wrestling ring, the first 10 years of my career, the first time I ever took that bump was in front of people. Because there was no practice. And if you couldn't figure out how you were going to do something, you asked somebody in the locker room, then they'd tell you verbally, do this.
Yeah, Memphis wasn't known for training their managers how to take bumps.
Well, nobody was. You didn't have nobody. I've said this before. We didn't get there early enough to practice. If you were in a business, well, okay. But anyway, but also as far as Watts was so strict, he wanted wrestling in his matches more so than in the Tennessee territory or some other territories. But Bobby and Dennis could adapt to that. But I'm seeing them kind of work a different style. And then I start to understand the difference in the styles of the different territories and how you would adapt. Because then when we went to Dallas, it was a different thing entirely because they didn't care about so much wrestling in the matches as Watts did. It was more high spots and or just solid work, but the rings were harder and you had to adapt. And even Bobby had to adapt because those rings were fucking ridiculously stiff. They were padded to the hilt and had no give. So that's the exact opposite of a good bumping ring. But that's the point I'm making is that Bobby and Dennis were able to either just in the car or after we'd get a finish, explain to me just little bits of timing or little things, or we'd just talk about I'd hear them talk about what other people were doing wrong. And plus I got more confident also from being there and doing it and say, okay, this is working. They're not going to send us home. So I was able, as I said, in a year there, learning a lot of things from Watts and being able to do the promos transformed from night and day. I'm more Jim Cornette when I get to Dallas of the people that would know what Jim Cornette was. And really the Midnight Express was more as well because they'd had that, all had that year to not only figure each other out, but them to help bring me along. Because I knew how to talk and almost nothing else about serious in-ring psychology or how to put the matches together or what the fuck's stupid to do or not to do. And that was, where being in a car with Bobby and Dennis was him. And Dennis would sit there and plainly lay something out. Whereas with Bobby, it was just like he'd have observations or he'd just say things or make a joke or something and you'd kind of pick it up.
You know, one of the great things about Mid-South in 84 was the introduction of Power Pro Wrestling, which meant house show matches got on TV. And there's a few that always stay with me. Maybe because parts of those matches were used in the opening of the show eventually, but it's 2 Bobby bumps. One is simple, just him selling a punch. And the way he would grab his jaw and kind of go onto one foot for a second, it was perfect. And the other was, I don't remember if it had the orange canvas or not, but it was a Jim Duggan clothesline to Bobby.
The spear. Wasn't it? Or no, it was the clothesline and he went over backwards.
He went over backwards, and we've seen like acrobatic wrestlers do that where it looks flashy, but it looked there. It's so impressive.
He knocked him over backwards.
It looks like Jim Duggan's power knocked him over backwards. It looks so incredible.
You know why?
Because he did.
Because Jim Duggan's power knocked him over backward. No, I've just watched 5 matches with Bobby take the bump the exact same way. Because what he would do is when Duggan, and actually I think somebody else clothesline him, took the same bump. But when the guy would come with the clothesline with the right arm, Bobby would not only kick his feet out, but he would fucking have his left arm in front of the guy clotheslining him. Can you see there? Wait a minute, well, he'd have his arm in front of the guy clothesline, and he would hook the guy. As the guy ran past him, he'd give himself a little spin, and it would knock him literally fucking upside down. And sometimes he landed on the side of his fucking head, because it was literally knocking him upside down and ass over tea kettle. But yeah, it was fucking... that's just the selling of the face.
Yeah.
If normally a guy might give somebody a shoulder tackle and the guy take a flat back bump, but if you gave Bobby a shoulder tackle or you punched him in the face or whatever the fuck it may be, he may just boom. And he had the slap before anybody did, and you couldn't. It took me a while to figure out Bobby's slap, right? So it wasn't like the fucking leg slap class these days, but. If you hit him with the tackle, boom, he'd fucking grab his face. He would spit up in the air. He'd sell his fucking face. His feet would go bing, 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 like he's off balance. And then he would go fucking down to a knee and then bounce to his face. He would take a different kind of bump every time. And it looked like he'd got the shit knocked out of him. When I would, he'd be holding the baby face and I'd swing the racket and the baby face moves and whack him. And I knew the sweet spot to exactly where to swing, because when that baby face moved, Bobby, like a magician, was going to turn his head a certain way and put his hand up, and I would smack the fucking hand. And then when he got to trust me, then he would stop putting the fucking hand up, and I would just, I'd know the spot. And I don't remember ever potatoing him, but the spit would fly and it would look like I'd fucking killed him.
Whose idea was the crawling and the hugging and the kissing?
Dennis Condrey and Phil Higgerson used to do that. But, I mean, it's not like they invented it.
Right,
That's classic Southern heel wrestling, right? Goddamn, Dennis is the more stern one. And obviously Stan figured into all of this later on with a different type of personality, but just starting how we originated the flavor of the thing. Dennis has that stern personality and that stern face, and he's the one whereas Bobby, was just the maniac, right? So Bobby'd get boom, boom, boom. He'd take 3 or 4 bumps and he'd get up on his knees and run on his knees, wee, all the way over and hug Dennis. And he's on his knees in front of Dennis. And of course, the predominantly Southern working class, potentially homophobic audiences would have a field day with this. And then Dennis would goddamn look at the baby face with a pissed off look, and he'd reach down and he'd hold his hand out, and Bobby'd tag it, and he'd get in like, I'll do something about this. And then it was early on in Louisiana at one of the towns, Bobby and Dennis would give each other a high five before they would, at the start of the match, right? And one in and one out, and they'd start the match. Well, so then one time we started doing it. We're okay. Bobby and Dennis high five each other. I high five Dennis. I high five Bobby, and I've got the racket in my hand. So one of the fives is the racket. And then at a spot show, at some point, I just, as me and Bobby go to high five, I stop and I go, come here. And I give him a big hug, right? And he gives me a big hug, and the place goes ballistic. Okay, this is a lot easier than taking bumps for this reaction. So immediately I turn around like, what? What's the matter? What are you trying to wish him well and play innocent, right? And they're throwing shit. And so I don't know if it was that night. We started doing that for a while. And then one night I added the kiss on the cheek. We go to high five, stop, hug instead. The people are fucking screaming. I'm like, what's the matter? What's the matter? I'm like, okay, Bobby, go in there and break him in half. And I cup his chin like Christine Jarrett used to with the grip, but not hard, and turn his head and kiss him on the cheek. And my God, I've heard finishes that didn't get that much of a response. And everybody today is going to be saying, oh my God, that's horrible. I'm just telling you what the fucking people did. And what we did in those days was run across shit that people reacted to that we're just doing and do more of it. So that became, and after Dennis, when Stan became a part of the team, we still did that same pre-match thing. Bobby and Stan high five, me and Stan high five, me and Bobby, whoops, hug, kiss on the cheek. Go get him, Tiger.
What was a tougher move for Bobby? The move from the Tennessee territory to Mid-South, or the move from Huntsville to the dark side?
Well, see, it didn't pay as well, the move from Huntsville to the dark side, but the move to